good evening, everyone, from wherever you're joining us today virtually. I am Cemre Ülker, the US Director of the Journalists and Writers Foundation. I would like to welcome all you to the Threats of Journalism during the COVID-19 panel discussion. We have several distinguished journalists to share regional perspectives on the challenges of journalism and the importance of free media during this global health crisis. And to lead this important discussion, we have Mr. Behzat Fatmi from India. He's a political writer and commentator. He writes widely in the Indian and international media, mainly on Turkish politics. He's a non-residential research fellow at Turkey Institute. And thank you so much for all of our panelists. And Mr. Behzat, the floor is yours to lead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cemre. Good morning and good evening to everyone, those who are joining us from the US, South Africa, Bulgaria, and India, and from any other part of the world. I welcome you all on behalf of the Journalists and Writers Foundation to this virtual discussion on threats to journalism during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, to discuss this very important and relevant issue, we have a very distinguished set of panelists from United States of America, South Africa, and Bulgaria. We have Ms. Ellen Wolfhurst, Chief Correspondent in the Americas. She's working at the Thomson Reuters, USA. We also have Tembisa Pakude. He is the head of research relations at Al Jazeera Center for Studies in South Africa. We have Mr. Abdul Hamid Biliji. He is a journalist, editor, and foreign policy columnist. And we have Mr. Nikolai Krastev. He's a journalist and commentator based in Bulgaria. I welcome all the panelists to this very important discussion on this very relevant topic. Before I ask the questions to you, I would like to briefly give you a perspective on the issue from India. The pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, of course, has hit India as well, though not many cases have been reported in this country in comparison to a lot of Western European countries like in Spain, the UK, Italy, or the United States. But nevertheless, it has brought challenges to the government of India and to the people of this country, of this hugely populated country. Since it has affected the country on a whole, of course, it has affected the journalism in this country too, and the journalists and those who are in this profession. Recently, in the financial capital of India, more than 40 people, 40 journalists were found to be COVID positive. That is, of course, one point that the journalists, while doing their job, they are being exposed to a risk and the risk of the coronavirus, and they are being affected by that. They are contaminating the disease. But on the other hand, using this crisis as a pretext to clamp down on the dissenters and also the critics of the government is also a reality of this country. Unfortunately, recently, some very senior journalists from Kashmir, especially, were arrested on unspecified posts on the. The government claimed that they were trying to increase enmity in the society and discord in the society. So, and also a very senior journalist who runs a very prominent and critical independent media website. He was arrested. An investigation has been opened against him in a different state. So this kind of harassment by the government, by the authorities, is one thing that the journalists are facing during this difficult time. On the other hand, of course, the journalists who are working, who are trying to provide information to us are risking their lives by going to different facilities and exposing themselves to the virus. So, of course, the threat that this virus poses to the journalists across the world is significant, and of course we have to address this issue in a very serious manner. So, if to start with, if I ask the question to our panelists today, but before I ask that, let me kindly remind all our panelists that you have 2 to 3 minutes to answer all the questions. To answer each question, I will be asking a few questions to you during the coming 1 hour. So, to start with the first question, my question is, what are the threats to journalists during the COVID-19 pandemic worldwide? And how can we protect frontline journalists from these threats while doing their jobs? If I can ask Ms. Ellen Wolf first to address this question first, and then I will ask the same question to the other panelists. Ms. Wolf first.
Good morning. I think that the threats, I see it as the threats to the flow of information is what in the United States is the problem. We're not in a situation where journalists are, threatened with being arrested or jailed. But operationally, the job that you do is just suddenly all, the more difficult. You can't go out. You can't just approach people and talk to them and get the real story. You're terribly reliant on government sources that you don't necessarily want to be. And I think the second aspect of that is that a lot of institutions and politicians and others they want to control the story. So, for example, there's been states where you can't get an accurate count. Florida was having an issue where the medical examiners had one number, the governor's office had another, and so they were trying to shut each other down. The flow of information is I think one of the, not the biggest threat, but it's one of the bigger threats that we're facing right now.
Yes, and how can we protect frontline journalists from the threats that they are facing right now? Would you like to address that question?
That's a tough one. I think that in America, the rules and regulations exist to protect the press, more or less. But as we look at this, as the larger picture, it's the powers that be can get around those rules and regulations for now. So I don't know that I know the answer to how to protect us at this point, except that the weapons to protect us are there. It's a question of whether we can figure out how to use them at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If I can address the same question to Mr. Pakude.
Thank you. I think I'll echo what Ellen has just said in terms of centralization of information. For me, that's the biggest issue. Because we have now one source of information, so you have this monopoly in terms of how information is flowing. Most of the statistics and numbers we get from the government sources, and we have no way of verifying that. So for me, that's the greatest concern. And the other thing is where we sit in South Africa, and I think other African countries, there is an element of solidarity, an element of national cohesion in terms of what governments are doing in their efforts of trying to mitigate the scourge. And that also poses another challenge, because if you report anything out of script, you risk also a backlash from the community and those people we're trying to serve. So that's another challenge I think that we are facing as journalists in Africa, and I think generally, some of my colleagues something similar, that the streamlining of flow of information plus the prevalent wave of solidarity and nationalism in various countries where people are supporting their governments and through this. It's the challenge that I think we will have to deal with as we move along. But the other thing is, how our craft and business has actually, to an extent, losing value. There's so much information flowing at the moment, and it's difficult for anyone to claim exclusivity, which therefore means that you have to try very hard to even sell or get the value for what you produce henceforth. Because people, I don't think, post this COVID-19, were willing to pay or buy news moving forward, because it's just so much. You'll have to come up with something extremely exclusive for you to earn a living moving forward. So journalism has been rendered to an extent, cheap. We work very hard, but I don't think we will get compensated as we expect moving forward, because there's just too much out there. And anyone who hopes that they'll be making money or earning a living from writing, I think most of us will have to look at second jobs in order to sustain our lives moving forward, because the market or the readership and the broadcast is just flooded with people who are doing what we're doing. Most of them are trained journalists, but the majority of them are not. We have new social media activists who are just supplying information on a continual basis, and our work, which we pride ourselves of, often takes a backseat.
Thank you, Mr. Fakude. May I request Mr. Biliji to address this question, please?
Yeah, in my view, there are three challenges for journalism during this pandemic. One is about the challenge to life of journalists. Reporters are in a position to go to the events. We don't have the luxury to wait at home. We can make some interviews, but we need to go to hospitals, we need to go to patients, and we need to go to see the streets, what's happening around. So because of that, this is an important risk to the life of the reporters. And I know a lot of my friends who were covering, for instance, in New York, the first cases, but then I learned that they have been infected just during this job that they were doing. And the second challenge is about the business of media. The media is an essential part of democracy, but it is also in free countries, in democracy, it is a business. So as every business has been badly affected by this pandemic, the media company is also very badly affected. So advertisement revenues declined and circulations declined. And I see in different parts of the world, this is a very big challenge for the media companies. I recently talked to one of my friends from South Africa, and she was telling me that a lot of reporters were laid out. And I am hearing this similar story from some local newspapers in America. I have a friend who was working for a local paper in Florida, and I learned, unfortunately, that she is now not able to continue because she was laid off. So that's an important challenge, because if business cannot be sustained through circulation or advertisements, who will support media, how they will continue existing. If the government will support them, then this is an important way to censorship. So this is an important challenge that we need to address and talk about, think about how we can solve that problem. And the second thing is, of course, the third challenge is the government, increasing government pressure to control information. You know, many governments, maybe the old governments, define this as a war. So when you define something as a war, it means it is extraordinary. They will take some extraordinary measures, and they are inclined to control information and the news, to hide their failures and to show that they are great, they are very successful. So that is an important problem. Some of our colleagues are now in jail just because of telling truth, or their version, or the views that are conflicting with the official statements are paying the price by losing their freedoms. And that is different degrees of pressure, from China to Turkey, from India. I learned in India that a reporter was interviewing that a very famous medicine is not indeed effective against coronavirus. So just because reporting that, she was targeted as anti-national person. And this is a kind of intimidation, not being jailed yet, luckily, because India is one of the exporters of that medicine. And then when you say something, although it is truth, although it is fact, then you are seen as a person acting against the interest of a nation. So this is, in my summary, 3 challenges that we need to address now and in coming months.
Thank you very much, Mr. Biliji. May we have the perspective from Bulgaria, from Mr. Nikolai Krastev on this issue, please?
Hello, I am Nikolai Krastev from Bulgaria, but I'm living in a very interesting region. It's southeastern Europe, on the Balkans. One intellectual in the region, Milenko Jerkovic, commented that in Croatia, although no state of emergency had been introduced, it was said that leader of the health dictatorship was in fact the prime minister of right-wing government, Mr. Andrei Plenković, along with interior minister, Mr. Bujinović, even before the introduction of measures of the fight against COVID-19, he held a meeting with the media under their control, who say that should inform us they were told. Not only representative of 2 independent media in Croatia attending on this media. In my region, we have very bad signal also in Serbia. For example, 2 journalists arresting last 2 weeks, one in Serbia and second in Kosovo. One lady from one website, Nova, Serbian website Nova. His name is Ana Lalic. She is suffering because it's reported that the Novi Sad hospital from lack of protective mask and clothing, and working in the house at the time of pandemic was detained for 48 hours, and prosecutor accused her for causing panic. The arrest also condemned by numerous local and foreign media protection organization, and one of the opposition party in Serbia accused the president, Mr. Aleksandar Vučić, of abusing the state of emergency the opposition accusing the government also of creating the legal conditions of for self-dialing with independent journalists by setting up special government headquarters that could only provide information and any other attempt to inform gross violation. This is a very specific situation. One more example I take that since the outbreak of the crisis in Serbia, one journalist has been arrested. Another journalist from Kosovo also arrested about violation curfew. That's in media situation on this moment, not only in the Bulgaria but only in Balkans Peninsula.
Thank you very much, Mr. Costa. So clearly, one of the problems that the journalists and journalism is facing during this period is the flow of information, and the problems, the hurdles that are coming in the way of flow of true information. So my question is, my second question now is related to the overall freedom of the press, which is how did the COVID-19 pandemic impact journalism and press freedom worldwide? And what challenges have journalists faced in reporting facts, statistics, and stories of cases, deaths, and precautions taken by the government? Again, may I request Ms. Wool first to address this question first?
I think that in the United States, that's a good question because I think it has to do with the position that the media is now put in to tell the story of the virus. And I think what's happened here, most significantly, comes from the top. I mean, we've all seen the White House press briefings and the behavior and the insults. And I think what's happened, which I think is really, really serious, is the denigration of the media. That we're all lying and fake and not to be trusted, means it's adding to the public health crisis because the public needs information and they need the right information. But when the public doesn't know who to trust and everybody's being tainted as being liars, there's no good source they don't know where to go. So, and if they're not getting the right information in this pandemic, people die. So I think that the belittling of the media, which was sort of a sparring contest and almost entertaining sometimes before all this happened, has taken on just really, really dire, deadly tones. And I think for me, that's the biggest impact that the impact that the pandemic has had on journalism, but also turning that around, it's the impact that journalism has had on the pandemic because we are left struggling to defend our integrity, to give people the right information.
Thank you. Since Mr. Biliji is also in the US, so I'd like to address this question to him now before I go to our other panelists. Mr. Abdulhamid Biliji.
I am observing the attitude of the American government to media and the different colors of media covering this pandemic, and it is not much promising, I could say at least. If I mean, this is Americans are lucky that there are multiple voices in media. If, for instance, America had only a media similar to Fox News, I guess the number of that will be 10 times more than that, because the Fox News did not take the issue seriously in the beginning. And it has enormous impact and effect on conservative American people, maybe 30-40% of Americans, they were saying, very prominent journalists, reporters were saying that this is a hoax. This is a game. This is not something serious. At the time that people in Italy were dying. Mm-hmm. And this had a very negative impact, in my view, on government and on the Trump administration's policies, because Trump is very much affected personally by the Fox editorial, their coverage of things in America and in the world. So we can debate rightly that if today America is doing a poor job in fight against this pandemic, media has an important negative effect on that. And this is debated, and this should be debated. But luckily, I mean, there was, as I said, there were multiple voices. I mean, it is not just Fox News in America, but there's CNN, ABC, NBC. All of those other media put a lot of pressure, which changed the line of the government, Trump, and then they started to take it seriously. But of course, that loss of time had a very, very bad effect. But when I look at the issue globally, I see very important thing, and I like to underline that. If this coronavirus emerged not in China, but in Norway, we would not be seeing that tragedy. It would not turn into a pandemic. Why? Because in China, we now know very well that a lot of doctors were silenced, and the bloggers were silenced, and a lot of misinformation were reported to the World Health Organization, and a lot of mismanagement happened just because of the authoritarian nature of the Chinese government. I don't blame anyway Chinese people or China as a state, as a nation. But the party's, the Communist Party's attitude to control media, control information, caused China an important loss, and of course a terrible loss for whole world. We lost a lot of our lovely ones, and whole world economy destroyed almost. I mean, so I say as a conclusion that freedom of media, in that case, in these corona days, we should understand how vital it is. As I say, I mean, if this coronavirus emerged in Norway or in Sweden, in any democratic country, we would not be living such a terrible thing. We would not be in prison at our homes, and we would not lose a lot of our loved ones. And this is very important. And I think some people in the world will argue that the central government, a strong government, is better in addressing a fight against pandemic. But this is not correct. I underlined the Chinese experience, but look at very successful examples that were able to manage this crisis from New Zealand to Germany. I mean, democracy is not a problem. If there is responsible government, if there is transparent, relationship between the government and the people, like in South Korea, there are lots of examples that are democracy, but were successful in managing the crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Biliji. Now I would like Mr. Pakude to address this question, please. And I again request all the panelists to please stick to the time limit of 2 minutes for each question. Thank you. Mr. Pakude, please.
I think what Abdul Hamid is raising is very, very important. And from where I sit, it's contrary to what has been said in the United States. We've seen a strong partnership between, well, a very positive and a friendly relationship emerging during this time between journalists and government. There's been very strong partnership, and journalists have been instrumental in disseminating very important information. Many people, particularly in rural parts of South Africa, rely on radio, for example, and other forms of media outside the social media. And journalists have been very instrumental and useful in terms of disseminating that information. So there has been an improvement, I would say, in terms of relationships between government and journalists in this part of the world has improved. We, most of the government officials even refer to journalists as colleagues, particularly those that are in charge of ministries of information and communication. So the relationship between the media and government during this time, at least from where I sit, has been quite positive, and have also, to an extent, facilitated the movement of journalists. There have been several press conferences and meetings where journalists have been invited to facilitate the process moving forward on how they should go about reporting. So we have seen something different. I'm not saying it's the same in other African countries. And I know, for example, that some despots are very happy because there are extraordinary injunctions during this time, and it serves them very well to continue oppressing and suppressing certain freedoms. But from where I sit, I think it has been a very interesting time in terms of journalist-government relationship. We've seen an improvement in that relationship.
Thank you very much. Mr. Krastev, can we have perspective from Bulgaria?
In Bulgaria and my region, West Balkan, have a very interesting moment about the working of every journalist. Media in our region, in this moment of COVID-19, open many stories about the corruption, especially for Bosnia. I told you that scam involving the supply of 100 ventilation machines, which were bought at the heavily inflated prices from China at 10 million euro. This revelation pumped the head of civil defense of Bosnia and Herzegovina, who went through the supply of this device to Mr. Fahrudin Solak to ask the prosecutor office to investigate journalists for biased public information, as he put it. This same situation we have in another country of Southeastern Europe, is Slovenia, who is a member of the European Union. But the parliament also debating about the involving of this ventilator machine. Or the region of the Balkans, this problem is very, very big. And many journalists speaking about this in radio, on televisions. Yes, of course, I remember that Mr. Mehmet Halilovic, who is from Bosnia, ex-ombudsman for media, who say that now happened that we're in the mirror in which the incompetent rules lock, and many governments in the region have very, very specific interests to try to push the media on the region.
Thank you very much. Now, my next question is about the new legislations and emergency laws that may have been imposed and introduced in different countries. So the question is, how do the new legislations and emergency laws, if any, have been introduced in the countries that you are based in or your expertise is on, to abuse the right of the freedom and access to information while reporting the global health crisis? May I request Mr. Abdul Hamid Belidi to address this question, because I know that he has some expertise. He has a lot of expertise on Turkish politics, and the introduction of new legislation and emergency laws have happened in that country. Maybe not in this context, but previously laws have been abused to crack down on the dissidents. So I wonder if he has something to say about the.
Yeah, I'm personally a journalist in exile since 2016. So I am already persecuted. I was the editor of the largest daily paper, the daily newspaper, which was shut down. Similar to more than 200 other media outlets, which were silenced in last 3-4 years. And a lot of my friends currently are in jail. More than 150 colleagues are behind bars. And with all these figures, Turkey ranks in the International World Press Freedom Index as 154th out of 180 countries, which is drastic, which is terrible. Just 20 years ago, Turkey was ranking 99th. So can you imagine? I mean, almost 56 levels worse than it was before. And a lot of pressure is already there. I mean, 95% of media is under the control of ruling party or one person, the President Erdogan. So it is not a media, it is a propaganda machine. The 5% independent media is barely surviving under very tough conditions. So this was the situation when we had the pandemic, when we had the coronavirus. So this just added another layer on the press freedom problem in Turkey. So how it affected, there has been different aspects, but there was an interesting opportunity, but the Erdogan government unfortunately missed it. Turkish jails are over capacity. More than 300,000 people are there, but the capacity is 200,000 something. And the prisons in this pandemic are very important hotspots. So many people, doctors are saying that this is very dangerous. So the government decided to release some people just to make the prison conditions better. And they decided, they made a bill at the end of which 90,000 people were released. But journalists are not in that 90,000 people. There are thousands of teachers, academics, doctors, nurses, housewives, midwives. They are left in jail. So I had columnists at the age of 70 years old. I mean, at the age of 70 years, but in jail, who's a professor of political science. So this is a big danger, and now we are having a very bad news that the virus is expanding within jails, as in other countries, in America as well. Jails are very dangerous for this. So what happened? I mean, that opportunity, unfortunately, was lost. So there is this, the opposition parties are bringing the issue to Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court. I hope there is a decision by the Supreme Court to cancel that injustice and release our friends, journalists, intellectuals, academics from jail. But on top of that, in last 2 months, our friends, reporters who are still active in Turkey, were put behind bars just for tweeting. You know, in many countries, governments are helping citizens by giving some extra money. But in Turkey, the government decided to give certain bank accounts for people to make donations. So this is a very big contrast, you know. So a reporter tweeted about that, saying, I mean, teasing that this is ridiculous, you know. The governments are helping their citizens, but you are giving a bank account number asking people to donate. So this journalist now in jail just for that tweet. And what is the crime? What is his crime? His crime is inciting public to enmity and ridiculing religion. So these are the claims. And another very important TV channel, anchorman of a TV channel, was investigated now for just another tweet. What was the issue? You know, since Erdogan were asking people to donate money to help government to fight the corona crisis, so that journalist said that be careful about your bank, the money you deposited to the banks, because government can confiscate them. So that became the reason for asking 3 years prison terms, 3 years prison for this very important anchorman of a very important national TV channel. So these are just a couple of examples, but you can understand how tough it is to trust information coming out of Turkey, and how tough it is to do journalism in such an environment.
Yeah, thank you very much. I remember Mr. Fakude saying that in South Africa, relation between the government and media has been positive during this period in particular. But I wonder, does he have something to say about other countries in Africa? Has there any new law or legislation been introduced in those countries? If Mr. Fakude can answer that.
Well, I'll start first by South Africa. But the media has been declared as an essential service. That in itself is positive, which means therefore that you can do your work freely without being you are not prohibited to practice journalism. So that's one very positive thing that we have seen, that the media is declared as an essential service in terms of continually updating the people about what's going on. The only difficult thing, of course, is that it's difficult for the media to reach its subject or people that's supposed to be reporting on because of the restricted movements of the people. At the moment, people are allowed to be outdoors between 5 in the morning and 8 in the evening. After that, no one is allowed to be out except for those that are regarded as essential service or have permissions to be outside their homes. It's difficult to say the same about other African countries, which have, ordinarily been very suppressive in terms of journalism. I can only imagine that it has gone even much more stringent during these difficult times. I can quote, for example, countries like Uganda. Things for journalists. Things were not easy before COVID for journalists. Now with the state of emergency, things are even much more difficult. South Africa has even avoided to use or to embrace legal terms such as state of emergencies because of the connotations associated with that. We have a history in this country. And when you start saying state of emergency, people get very scared. But in other African countries, the situation has been much more different to what we're experiencing here. There's been more suppression, as I've said, in countries like Uganda. We know, for example, in Egypt, the situation has been extremely difficult. We still have journalists there that are arrested, and the movements of journalists are even much more harder now that we have COVID-19 than it was before. So those are the few examples I can make. But regarding South Africa, I think again, the fact that the government has said that journalists are or form part of what is known as essential service, that in itself as positive by many.
Thank you. Thank you. May I request Ms. Wolfhorst to address this question, if there is some development, even similar to this in the US as well?
I have to say, I don't think so. I mean, I think the the impact of the lockdowns has kept journalists down and such. But I don't think the issue of uh, laws and new laws and legislation is one that's that pertinent here. So no.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Krastev, would you like to address this question, please?
During the emergency situation in Bulgaria, and not only in Bulgaria, in most countries of West Balkans, especially in Bulgaria, situation emergency, we don't have special legislation, but that is not the same case in Serbia,
Mhm.
Macedonia. Have some specific moment I told you in the beginning about arresting our colleague from Serbia, Madam Ana Lalic, from the Nova website. This arrest also condemned by numerous local and foreign media protection organization, and one of the opposition party of Serbia accused the president Alexander Vucic of abusing the state of emergency. The opposition accusing this government of creating the legal condition of self dialing with independent journalists by setting up a special government headquarters that could only provide information, and any other attention to inform was a gross violation. This is a very big example about this journalism in the Serbia, especially, is not a good way on this moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Moving on to our next question, which is there a trend towards power grip and autocracy, even in democratic countries during this health crisis? May I request Ms. Wolfhorst to answer this question first?
I'm not sure if it's a trend, but it is absolutely something that happens. I think what I was not necessarily a health crisis either, but I was thinking that one thing that came to mind was in the wake of September 11th, there was the passage of the Patriot Act in America, which severely affected civil liberties and allowed for a lot of surveillance that I think people would not otherwise have been so tolerant of. So I think overall, yes, I think what happens is I think they call that it's the shock doctrine that people, if you're in power, you see an opening because you have a populace that is stunned and fearful and looking for guidance, and maybe finds some authority to be almost reassuring. So yes, I think all those are ingredients for massive abuses of power in a democracy. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Biliji, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah, I agree with my ideas of the colleague raising. The only fact that the government is becoming much more important is not something very good. So the people are losing their jobs. The companies are, losing, and all the people, the civil society, media, companies looking to government to get some money to rescue them, to save them. So that is a big potential to be misused. There is a big potential to be misused if there is not an important tradition of democracy in any country. So, but if there is such tradition, of course, people will not accept that. There will be counter forces. The political parties will debate about those kind of attempts. But if there is a weak level of democratic tradition, there is a huge danger of even some people, you could find more people accepting government to have more authority on their personal lives just because of their safety, you know. So these times, I mean, this 9/11 example is a very important case. You know why people accepted such law, the Patriot Act? Because they thought their life is at risk. So they said we can forget about some of our freedoms. So this is such a condition. But on the other hand, I mean, when I guess the when at the end of this coronavirus, of course, it will be over one day. But then we will look at the performance records of governments, and then we will see some of the rankings. How many people lost their lives? Of course, depending on that information is correct. So I'm sure that the free and democratic countries will be much better, and it will be the vital importance of free media, the freedom of information, freedom of expression will be understood much better. You know, as I said in the beginning, if China had more democracy, if they did not suppress the voices in the first place, in the first weeks, we would not be at this point, which means democracy, freedom of expression is an important element of good governance. That is good for not just Americans, for Europeans, for Turkish people, but for Chinese people as well, for Russians as well. Because when you don't trust to your government, so in such a situation, you know, in the corona is something new. You don't know what is it. Who can have the monopoly of information about that? Even scientists don't know. So the only solution is multiple voices, freedom of expression, doctors, media, politicians, all of them debating and trying to find the fact and the truth. Because no one has the monopoly. No one cannot.
Thank you. I'm sorry for interrupting. We're running out of time actually, so we'll have to be quick. May I request Mr. Fakude to answer this question, please?
Well, I think one thing that we've learned during this time is that the responsibility of strengthening democracy is not a part-time responsibility. It's a full-time responsibility, something that we have to take seriously, that we have to continually work towards strengthening our democracies, because we see now in many countries what has happened to those who thought that they were free, those who thought that their systems work. Overnight, certain rights have been usurped, and many people are left without basic rights, and they've got absolutely nothing to say about that. In South Africa, we have similar tendencies. There are certain members of government who are displaying the autocratic tendencies, particularly when dealing with members of the public. You can see that these people are definitely tempted, and they will wish, many of them, that this situation is prolonged so that they can have this, exaggerated power bestowed upon them by the current situation. So that's extremely dangerous. But at the same time, in countries like the United States and Britain, and to an extent our country in South Africa, we've also seen the democratic shock absorbers. The civil society is responding in certain ways, and they're continually vigilant on any abuse of power, particularly by security forces and government officials. So there has been that reaction from civil society. But yes, I do agree that the temptation is there, and we have seen it here as well, where certain members of government are overreacting, and one can only conclude that they are praying that the situation is prolonged so that they can continue enjoying the powers that have been bestowed upon them by this current situation.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Fakude. Finally, can I request Mr. Krastev to address this question, please?
Tendency about the autocratic on the Balkans is the very big in my region, especially in Serbia, also in Croatia and Bosnia. But in Bosnia is some special case. That place is the national autocracy on this moment. But I want to tell you about the situation in Serbia when the President Vučić speaking during the many times spoke like on expert topics related to overcoming the consequences of COVID-19. 19 instead of doing medics. This is a very funny, but it's funny in the first plan. In the second plan, situation in Serbia is not very well because that Mr. Vucic make a full monopoly about the political situation on Serbia. In Bosnia, it's a very specific situation. I can say that's a very divided country on national principles. In Croatia, government have some specific health dictatorship. What say the doctors? What is the true? You don't believe in different information. Maybe something. It's a situation in Bulgaria because also have a similar situation. But this tendency of autocratic on the Balkans is a very specific moment who take that who is very connected with the history and tradition on this region.
Thank you. Now, moving on to our final question, which is how do we protect human rights and freedoms in the new era after COVID-19? May I request Mr. Krastev to address this question first, and then we can ask the question to other panelists.
This is a good question about the moment of protection of people, but I mean that freedom, human rights, and freedom is a crucial moment of our life in this moment because we living in a specific moment. In the first time, humanity, it's very specific moment like COVID-19. Maybe in the future must be more than infections, but this is a moment when we see what happened and check what's happened in the society in this moment, in the protect of journalism, also that press freedom worldwide. This is the first time we don't know what's happened in the situation. We're speaking about the right of journalism, about the freedom of journalism, but we're living in one very specific moment when we see the new legislation of emergency law when abuse of the right of freedom. This is a very interesting moment when we see what's happened in the end of this process when open that new moment.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Fakude, please.
I think, first of all, let me just say that let's remember that we're not activists, no politicians. So we're not promoting democracy, but what we do is we report news. And the best thing as journalists is to speak truth to power without fear nor favor. But I think we also need to be careful of not crossing the line of becoming activists, which is always tempting, of course, because we love democracy so much. But as journalists, we must also always remember that our responsibility is to report news and speak truth to power without fear nor favor, And we can support democracy by making sure that we do exactly that. We cover relevant stories. We are not fearful. We're brave, and we don't listen to governments to dictate what kind of stories we should cover or not. So to answer the question is, and I'm sure it's asked by one of our viewers or people who are watching us wherever they are, is that journalists are not activists, and we, there's always a temptation for people to put us in that sport where we start fighting for freedom, for rights and freedoms and all of that. We're not there to do that, but through our work of speaking truth to power without fear or favor, we do exactly that, which is promoting journalism and democracy.
All right, thank you. Mrs. Wolf first, please.
I would just echo what you just said about, that we are not activists, but we do have a role to play in democracy. I think that just insofar as in America, to protect human rights, or just say, let's say, to protect the freedom of the press after this is all over, I think we have the institutions, the legal institutions and frameworks to protect our rights here, but I think that it's a question of how much energy and enthusiasm we will apply to that effort, because it just gets caught up in a political morass. And I also think that enforcing those institutions in that framework requires a certain amount of public will. And I just think that public will is going to be a big question, because I think we're just going to be so traumatized, I think, by everything that has happened to us, that that could sort of just take over, and the public could just feel like there are way bigger issues and way bigger problems to address than ours.
Thank you. Mr. Biliji, please.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, journalists cannot defend democracy themselves. We have a role to play, but it is all society, all people should be aware of importance of democracy and trying to protect it. So without that consciousness, journalists cannot do it, as I couldn't do it in my country. You see, I am in exile now. So this is an important point. The second thing is, the journalist has a duty to tell the truth to power wherever it is they are functioning. So we will do that, and we will be ready to face some consequences, to pay a price for that. But there is also another issue, that we are, as a world, very much integrated with each other. So we don't have the luxury to say that I can have a very peaceful life in Florida and forget about what's happening in Syria or in Turkey or in China or in Afghanistan. You see, that coronavirus case, this pandemic, if it doesn't teach us that, nothing can teach us ever. This is a crisis coming from wet markets being allowed in China, in Wuhan region. So, which means governments should not be free to do whatever they like. And there should be a better international, transparent, effective organization, United Nations, World Health Organizations. And this is not, we should not leave that topic to governments only. The Chinese people, Turkish people, American people should be actors. And if we can get those lessons, that would be very important to fight against other solutions that cannot be solved without integration, without global solutions like global warming, immigration, terror. All these problems, any country cannot solve alone. So this is very important to understand, that any problem in Turkey can cause big problem in America one day. So we should be conscious of what's happening in any corner of the world. That's very important. That's a very important lesson if we can learn from this pandemic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Biliji. Now, we have addressed all the questions that we had in our mind, but we have some questions from the viewers as well. Given the paucity of time, I'd be able to take perhaps only one question from them. One of which is from Mr. Turkmen Terzi, and he is asking, South Africa and Italy have declared media as an essential service. Could the panelists explain how media is covering this pandemic under lockdown in different countries? So can Mr. Krastev explain maybe now what's happening in Bulgaria? How is media coping up with this crisis?
In Bulgaria, the situation it's, I mean, maybe normally in this moment we don't have arresting journalists. Our journalists have full information every day, every not working every day of a week in Bulgaria. Have a special court who have information, full information, 1 and more hour about the COVID situation in Bulgaria, especially for the last day. And many journalists have information and speaking more question about the situation with the COVID in my country. But not same situation have journalists, for example, in Serbia, where that must take the question before the start of the press briefing when stated the president that's the medicines in this moment about the situation in COVID-19 in Croatia. Also, we have only press briefing and not so many questions. This is not a good signal about the freedom of media, especially in Serbia, where that press briefing is online, not in live journalists who take the questions from the headquarters of health. This is a very interesting situation, not very good because it's this situation change of position of journalists, not really working on this moment.
Thank you. May I request Mrs. Wolf first to answer this question, please?
So if I understand it, it's how are we covering this under lockdown? Is that?
Yes. In those countries where media hasn't been made under category of essential services.
Well, I think we're essential here in the U.S. So I'm not sure. Yeah. So we're just doing it carefully. I'm not sure it's for us then. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Biliji, do you have something to add to this?
Yeah, as far as I follow, the reporters and journalists are trying to do their best, but there is a big fear factor because just one editor of a local daily in Turkey was arrested just because an article stating that the death of 2 persons were from COVID-19. So if even that little information causes you to be arrested, then you need to be careful. This is very important problem. I mean, I like to underline the fact that almost 500,000 websites are blocked currently in Turkey, 500,000 websites, and 72,000 Twitter accounts are blocked, including my verified Twitter account. So when I tweet something, people in Turkey cannot see, cannot read what I say if they don't use VPN. Even there is some control, type of control over VPN entries as well. So, I mean, it's tough. Unfortunately, we are in such a situation. And if it helps to fight against this virus, it doesn't. Turkey is seventh worst country in the world. So controlling information, suppressing, oppressing journalists or doctors is not helping to be successful in fight against coronavirus. So this is a very good example in that regard as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Mr. Fakude, would you like to add something to it?
Well, nothing much. I think I've said already that we operate under essential services. You know, even attitude here has been that, you know, the different laws govern different types of legislation. The government here wisely decided on a disaster. You know, we're in a state of a disaster instead of a state of emergency, which would have required a different type of legislation, including controlling movement and freedom of the media. So the fact that they've decided on a state of disaster, which gives media a certain type of freedom, that in itself has been quite good in terms of the improving of relations between government and journalists.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Fakude. Now, maybe take just one question, and I request all of you to address this very, very quickly. How can we preserve the rich legacy of journalism for the next generation of youth who are desperate to voice their concern and their voices? Mr. Fakude, would you like to?
Can you repeat that, please?
How can we preserve the rich legacy of journalism for the next generation of youth?
Oh, all right. How can we preserve the journalism, basically?
Yes, yes.
Very importantly, first of all, we have to encourage journalism schools. We have seen that there's been a reduction in terms of sponsorship of journalism schools around the world. So we need to encourage that. But at the same time, for those of us who've been in the business for a long time, we need to continually offer our services for free in terms of educating our journalists, particularly in our newsrooms. We know that there's been this cleavage has continued to widen as the newsrooms around the world is getting younger and younger. Many experienced journalists find themselves somewhere in the corner of offices, not necessarily working with the media-savvy youngsters. And that in itself has robbed, I would like to believe, young journalists or those who are entering the fraternity a much more needed skill and experience that would have ordinarily helped them if they've kept close with those journalists. I'm lucky to be working for an institution which doesn't retire journalists, but it actually shifts them into another place within our institution. For example, Al Jazeera has started something called Al Jazeera Center for Studies, and we've got Al Jazeera Media Institute, where veterans like myself find space to continue contributing towards journalism. So perhaps that could be another suggestion, that news media institutions should look at establishing other platforms for veteran journalists, instead of us retiring the experienced elderly or retired, in inverted commas, journalists. We don't retire them, but we put them in these places where they can remain as a good resource for young journalists who are entering the media fraternity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Krastev, very quickly, please.
I don't have some words about this, but we have a specific moment for journalism now have many challenges for her job, and for financial independence. This is a very important moment, how we live on this moment medium, and what's happened with many colleagues. For example, I told you one on information situation, information that many media in Bulgaria have finance very bad situation. It's not good. Maybe that crisis with COVID-19 go to one good lesson that media must be prepared only for this moment.
Right. Mrs. Wolfers, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think the answer that I would come up for that question is to preserve the legacy of journalism for the next generation. It's up to us to do it right, and to do it in such a way that we can underscore the value and the importance of good journalism. And I think a big part of that is to make sure that we distinguish ourselves from the noise of politics and the noise of social media, and do what we know how to do well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Biliji, very quickly.
I agree. All the points are very important. First, we should be a good example for young generations by being fair, good journalists, quality journalists. That's an important burden on our shoulders. And the second thing is, media is changing and facing a lot of challenges, declining circulations and changing habits of readership, etc. But there's a very important positive aspect. It is becoming much easier to tell truth. This program normally could be costing maybe hundreds and thousands of dollars, but now we are doing it without maybe any cost, which is a big, huge opportunity for young people. But these young people should get this virus, journalistic virus, combined with the new possibilities of technology, which will create a good perspective, I think, for the next generations and for the future. That finishing with a positive, optimistic note.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. So we have come to the end of our very, very productive discussion. Thank you to all our panelists, and also to everyone who joined us from different countries. Finally, in my concluding remarks, I would just like to say that, of course, this pandemic has brought a lot of threats and challenges to the freedom of the media. But at the same time, as we heard from Mr. Fakude, that in countries like South Africa, the relations between government and the media have actually improved, and actually they have been doing something positive and productive to address this issue, this grave threat to the humankind. So, of course, the flow of information there in a lot of countries, it is being curtailed, and there is also the threat to business, as there is a threat to business in all sectors, including there is a threat to the business of journalism too, as Mr. Biliji highlighted in his initial remarks. So despite all the challenges, we do see that there are some positive developments too in some parts of the world. So we hope and pray that the positivity is increase, and the challenges and the problems that we are facing now get over as soon as possible. So I thank again to all our panelists and the audience for joining us today. I wish you I wish and pray for your safety and good health. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I wish you good luck.